Hello, and welcome to Civics Forward. I'm Michael Carney, and I am honored to lead a conversation today with Dr. Kathleen Hall Jamieson of the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks for joining us today, Kathleen.
It's good to be with you.
So I'd like to start this conversation with the latest research that you published about the civic knowledge among Americans. The big takeaway for me anyway was that 1 in 4 could not name a single branch of the government. Now, I know that's kind of a simplified version of what you found, but could you tell us a little bit more about the survey and what it does tell us?
The survey is a survey of adults in the U.S. population. And so when we say, oh, the students in schools don't know as much as they should, this is not about the students in the schools. This is about people who are now in the adult population. They are able to vote. They are able to actively engage in a process in which, if they don't understand branches, they might not know where you ought to try to intervene to try to advance the agenda that you want to see advanced. They also probably are going to have real trouble understanding much of what's happening in the news as branches of government clash over things. And in particular, they're not likely to understand, if they can't understand what the branches are at the federal level, they're not likely to understand how we divide power up at the state and the local level either, which means when they're trying to figure out how you get change in your locale, they might not understand the ways in which you should move to get what you'd like out of a responsive governmental system.
So you've been doing this study for 16 or so years.
Yes.
Is this an outlier, or is it indicative of some bigger issues?
No, this is actually a reversion to the mean that we've seen across time. We saw an uptick in the past couple of years, which we attributed to having the branches in the news. And so it's possible that people learned this in grade school or high school, and it's deep in memory. They haven't really used the knowledge for a long time. And so when someone asks them top of head, so open-ended question, can you name the 3 branches? And they say yes, and then we say, could you name them for us? That the knowledge isn't readily accessible, but that it becomes more accessible when the branches get into the news. So in the prior years in which we saw the uptick in ability to name branches, and also uptick in ability to name the rights and freedoms protected in the First Amendment, that may have been a function of the contest between the branches, for example, over impeachment of Donald Trump, or the conflicts that arose because you had protests on multiple fronts, and as a result, a greater awareness of freedom of speech as protected against government action, but also right to peaceably assemble. So to some extent, this may be that some of the knowledge is there, and it's more likely elicited when there's something in the news that triggers it. But here's the problem. If you don't know the branches to start with, you're going to have some trouble making sense of the news, even when it's in the news initially. And even that uptick didn't put the majority of individuals in the right place, knowing some fundamentals such as, can you name 3 branches?
So help me unpack what you just said. It sounds like there is a priming effect from the media that kind of helps bring this back to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that we really don't have something to worry? We don't have to worry about data points like this?
No, what it means is that we had an uptick, but we didn't still get to the majority of the people in the United States could name, in a random sample of people from the United States could name all 3 branches. But what it means is there is a capacity for what's in news to affect what we do know and understand about government. But there's a caution here as well, because imagine that you don't know anything about our system of government. So you just landed from someplace in which there's just no awareness, and you simply picked up the best of our available news. So pick your favorite, whatever you think the best of our available is, and pretend that you know nothing and ask, how much sense can you make about, for example, actions by the president in relationship to the Congress and the courts if you don't have that foundational knowledge? It's possible that a large swath of the citizenry can't even make sense of what they're reading when they're reading about national politics, because they don't understand where the rights and prerogatives and boundaries are within each of the branches. It would be helpful, journalists, if when you're writing these stories, you could just put comma, and I know you're from a former journalist, to indicate a little bit of background knowledge for those who would like to be brought up to speed to better understand what those prerogatives are, where the checks and balances are, and what the relationship as a result of all of this is to the capacity of the system to act. So I've spent most of my career studying how we elect. And one of the problems with the way in which we elect is politicians stand up and they say, if I'm elected, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Well, if you don't realize that, for example, when you're electing a president, that person is constrained by need for congressional legislation to accomplish much of what the president is promising, it appears, to do unilaterally when the president campaigns. You're going to be really disappointed when your candidate wins and you don't see that action happening right away. So again, we could use some help for journalists to say, well, excuse me, Mr. Candidate or Ms. Candidate, you can't actually act on that without consent of Congress. And it does or does not look like you're going to have a Congress of your party that's going to be consenting in these circumstances. That would build branch knowledge. It would also put some constraints on promises people can't keep on their own.
So it sounds like journalists need to throw out the inverted pyramid and put the context up a little bit higher, because I think it does look like a lot of it's getting cut out these days.
Yeah. Well, it also means making sure that the terms that are just taken for granted have been defined. If you want an interesting experiment, go out and just pick the first 5 people you run into on the street and say, what is a filibuster? And, it's not a word we use ordinarily. So when you use the word, journalists, some commas in there that explain what this is and why it means that we're not necessarily going to get action, even if one party seems to have a majority in the Senate.
So let's use filibuster as an example. 50 years ago, if I had gone out onto the street and asked the first 5 people I encountered, what is a filibuster, would I have gotten a better answer?
Well, first we have to ask, when did the filibuster come in and be conventionalized? And that's one of those questions which I do not have a ready answer. But one of the questions we can ask is a really important question is, has civics knowledge changed across time? And the answer is, we don't think there's a golden age back there in which everybody was highly knowledgeable. But we are in an environment now in which there is more total action that is happening at the federal level. And there are more things that are consequential to individuals that are happening at the federal level. So it becomes more important that one command more of the details of what is happening, at least at the federal level. And where, for example, there might be institutional structures in place that minimize the likelihood that there's going to be action on some front that appears to have been promised by political leaders.
That's an important point you just made, and I don't know that I've ever heard anyone say it. So it's not that we should be looking back to some bygone time when we were all super well-informed citizens. What we really should be focusing on is the contemporary demand for knowledge and insight and understanding into your role as a citizen in this current environment.
Yeah, and not simply as your role as a citizen, but when you say, as a citizen who wants to accomplish what? And what are your rights and your privileges and your responsibilities as a citizen? So I'm sure you've had this experience, I have as well, watching individuals who come into the process of becoming citizens, the day in which this is officially happening. Well, first, they've taken a really pretty tough test. So they know a lot that the average US existing citizen by birth probably doesn't know. But what you see there is a kind of understanding that some of the things that we take for granted are privileges of citizenship. For example, serving on a jury should not be viewed as a terrible obligation. And oh my God, I actually heard someone say, I'm not going to register to vote because if I don't register to vote, I won't be called to serve on a jury. Well, trying to understand why those who are coming into the country as citizens are now so delighted to be here. They appreciate that trial by jury is something tied into our system of government. And it only works if people who are people of goodwill and integrity in the community will be willing to sit on juries and ensure that that process is fair and that the outcome has taken into account all of the rights and prerogatives of the individual who has a government acting against them in the form of a prosecutor.
We were honored a few weeks ago to host for the first time a naturalization ceremony here at the U.S. Chamber Foundation. And it was so moving to see people who have chosen this country, who have made, in some cases, significant sacrifices to be here, including we had 2 uniformed military or service members. And, it was just a stark reminder of what you just said, that this is a privilege, and it's one that we should not be taking for granted. As you look at citizenship and kind of knowledge, one of the things that has occurred in recent years is an effort by a number of states to require high school students to take some version of the civics portion of the naturalization test. What do you make of that? Is that helpful?
There are some parts of it that are, and as you know, it was revised and improved a while ago, but it's a starting point, not an end point. So commanding, it's trying to ensure that they command the foundational knowledge, and that's really important. But we also like to make sure that those people who are coming into the citizenship process understand the ways in which our institutions are structured on presuppositions about the norms that we bring to bear. And the citizenship test doesn't actually cover the kinds of norms we bring to bear. And I know that the kind of work that the chamber is now doing is focusing in part on how do we instill the kinds of norms of engagement that increase the likelihood that we can build communities that are able to make good decisions for the collective good of the community. And so it's a good starting point, but there are other dimensions that we want to make sure that we've developed a kind of a deep understanding and appreciation of about how our system actually works. If we don't respect each other enough to listen to each other, if we're not willing to find common ground with each other, we can't deliberate. And in the absence of deliberation, we may as well simply say, okay, well, how many of you are on this side? Raise your hand. How many of you on the other side? Raise your hand. Okay, you get to do what you want. Everybody else be damned.
So I'd like to explore another dimension, which is polarization. Based on your research and your scholarship, are we more polarized? It feels like we're more polarized. And if we are more polarized, what can we do to reduce polarization? Is it more knowledge? Is it more contact with different people? What's the secret?
Well, first, I'd like to make sure that when people think and talk about polarization, that they feature a facet of polarization that for a long time when we talked about it wasn't there. And that's called affective polarization. That's the emotion that you bring to bear about people who are on whatever you define as the other side. An increase in affective polarization means that people are now distressed when an offspring comes home and says, I'm going to marry this person, and the person is of a different political party. Affective polarization means that we're increasingly likely to think that people of the other major political party from our own not only disagree with us, but they disagree with us because they're not good people. So there's a moral dimension attached to the sense that we disagree with each other. And it's easy to move from that to say, and they're out to get me. They are an enemy. And as a result, I need to protect myself against them. And now you've broken down the assumptions that make the kind of common ground seeking that can bring communities together to create common solutions virtually impossible. Because why would I engage with someone I think is evil and out to get me? And they think the same thing about me that I think about them. You've fractured the assumption that underlays deliberation. And we've got to restore the capacity to listen to people with whom we disagree without judging them to be morally defective because they disagree or they have a different tribal allegiance. They identify with a different political party.
How do we rebuild that capacity to listen with respect to people who have different opinions? I mean, all hope cannot be lost, right?
I think we do it in classrooms, we do it in businesses, we do it in the environments in which we congregate. So one of the things that's important about the initiatives in the business community is that if you think of the places that we gather in which we have a collective goal, when you're in a business, you have a common goal. You want that business to succeed, and you want your workforce to be happy engaging in delivery of the service or creating the product, because that's just simply better for them, but it's also better for your bottom line. So when you've got people who are gathered around common purpose, you've already got the beginning of bridging their disagreements because they've got something in common, their dedication to the purpose of that group that is the workforce. If we can build back out of that and understanding that, yes, and there'll be people that I disagree with politically, but that doesn't mean I don't have some common ground. I think we're going to rebuild a sense of common ground out of the local, out of the individual business, out of the individual community. We still have cities, particularly the smaller cities in the United States, in which the citizenry comes together and agrees on what it needs to do without the kind of tearing apart that we see at the federal level. I think if we can build up from the ground up, from the local up, from the community and the business and the school up, we will increase the likelihood that eventually we can transform this into a system that works better.
So we've been making the business case for civics for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be eager to hear the argument you would make. So pretend, you are talking to small business owners and local chambers and other community leaders around the country. Why does this matter? And what can they do?
It matters because the small business owners and workers in communities taken together collectively are largely what constitutes the community. So when you've got larger employers and you wrap that around, you've got the small business employers and then you've got the large corporation employees, they also come down to local work environments. So once you say that, you have the opportunity to gather individuals up to increase the likelihood that their exchanges are exchanges that model civility, that they listen to each other with respect. That's good for the bottom line. You want to get innovation? Let's listen to the workforce about the way to make things better. Good managers know this. So to the extent that we inculcate those, and I will call them virtues, inside the workplace, we increase the likelihood that they are able to be exercised outside the workplace. And I think as a result, once you get past schooling, elementary, secondary, high school, community college, universities, the sector that we have remaining that has people in groups around common purpose, that sector is the business community. So to the extent that it is taking this task seriously and trying to ensure that people respect each other even when they disagree and are able to listen to each other's disagreements without maligning the other person, we're going to increase the likelihood that the business community is helping to solve this problem from the bottom up.
You've used the word disagreement at multiple points in this conversation, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about the role of disagreement in a democracy, because it seems like that and trust, or at least trust in the goodwill of others, are kind of at the crux of what we're trying to maintain. Is that an accurate assessment?
Actually, the disagreement is healthy in a system. We actually want to feature all of the alternative concepts of what constitutes the need for something. We want to look at all the alternative ways of addressing something once we've defined what the need is. And so you want to have someone who says, I think I've got a better idea. Let me tell you what the comparative advantage of my idea over your idea is. You want the alternative person to say, but I think there are strengths in my proposal, and they are this. And you want people to hear that in whatever the venue is. You want to hear it about how you're best going to create a strategic plan in order to increase the number of sales you're going to get about a given product. To the extent that we quell those disagreements, we minimize the likelihood we're going to get the advantage of all of the talent we've got at the table. So I like disagreement. I think disagreement is healthy. The question is how to increase the likelihood that when we have disagreement, it is constructive and it is disagreements that are increasing the range of possible alternatives on the table in a way that doesn't get in the way, ultimately, of being able to act. When disagreement gets in the way of ability to act, the system becomes dysfunctional. And largely at the federal level, we are there in many legislative domains, not all, in many legislative domains. And that becomes problematic if we actually do need to do something. We've got people with very different ideas about what we ought to do, and they can't find enough common ground to take any action, because then you're always defaulting to the status quo. And the status quo in some cases is really problematic.
So when in business schools that a lot of our audience have probably attended, one of the things that they teach you is heterogeneity of thought is really important for a successful business, especially an innovative one. And so is creating a level of psychological safety so that people can express viewpoints, because everyone is operating with a sense of shared purpose. You know what you're trying to achieve, to your point about profitability or operations or delivering. So I think you make some really important points about the application of some of those same principles to our civic space.
But let me add one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
You also assume the goodwill and integrity of the others with whom you are interacting. So if you add to your dimensions, you assume the goodwill and integrity. So what that means is you're able to say, we are disagreeing because we have a legitimate point of view and we have a legitimate disagreement. So our heterogeneous ideas at the table are coming from a good place, a good motivation. And if we can just hold that one additional piece in place, you have the foundations of deliberation about governance as well.
No, it's a really good addition. So before we get into audience questions, I want to talk a little bit about trust. Here at the Chamber Foundation, we spend a lot of time thinking and looking at trust. The Edelman Trust Barometer, for example, suggests that business, at a time when people have lost faith in many institutions, business remains one of the more trusted of those institutions. With that comes a lot of responsibility, and it's one of the reasons that we're so engaged in this area. You recently conducted a survey that produced some, at least to me, surprising results about the Supreme Court. What is the level of public trust in the Supreme Court as an institution? And perhaps more importantly, what does that mean?
Well, first, I want to put an important caveat in. Trust is very important, but you don't want unwarranted trust. You want warranted trust. You want trust that's justified by the trustworthiness of the entity in which you're investing your trust. So when someone says trust, I don't want people to uncritically trust, because that makes them subject to forms of manipulation that are problematic. I want them to trust when they are able to establish to their own satisfaction that this is an entity that's worthy of trust. So I want to keep trustworthiness in the equation all the time. And if trust is too high, what you get is people who potentially aren't being critical about things that need to be fixed in institutions. So you want people to say, is the trust earned? Is the trust warranted? One of the reasons that we have trust in some sectors of the business community with which we deal regularly is they're highly reliable. Their products work. When we have a problem, they address the problem for us. So I want to make sure we keep that in context. Now, with the Supreme Court, we've seen a decline in trust as a measure in Supreme Court. Confidence in court is down, and Supreme Court is down. That is, however, a function largely of Democrats saying that they are less trustful than they were. We've now got partisan polarized lines on which trust is dividing about the court. And it is driven by a perception, whether legitimate or not, whether justified or not, that the justices nominated by Republicans and confirmed are voting in sync with what you would expect them to do if they were legislators. And this is the reason I'm making the point this way is to say, when you saw justices act in ways that people thought inconsistent with the party position of the person who nominated them, which we saw in past years, you saw confidence go up. So we've actually seen it move both ways. And the fact that it moved up when you saw people appear to act in ways that weren't consistent with what you would expect politically, trust rose. So it's the synchrony between the perceived ideology of the person who nominates and the perceived ideology of the justice and the actions that seem consistent that seems to be driving this spread. I want to be, however, optimistic, not pessimistic, because when we've seen breaks from those expectations, we've also seen trust increase.
Well, thank you for explaining that. I'd like to shift. We have a number of audience questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can before the bottom of the hour. The first question comes to us and says, the person writes, how can we foster digital media literacy skills? I know this is something you are very passionate about, so I'd love to know what suggestion you have.
Yeah, there are many really good programs that are out there, particularly at the high school and elementary school level. If you have, person who's asked the question, if you have children, take a look at Newsfeed Defenders. It's a interactive game that we helped co-create with Justice O'Connor's iCivics program, in which students at the middle school level are invited to curate their own website, and there's no politics on this website at all. So we give them, in this video game, we give them pieces of information, and they have to decide if the information is reliable or not. And once they've determined whether it's reliable, then if they put it on their website, what we're trying to suggest in this game is you can get people to pay attention and stay on your website with reliable information. You don't have to go to unreliable information to accomplish that. So it's an exercise at the school level in getting students to ask an important question. What do I know about the authenticity of the source? What do I know about the accuracy of the information? And shouldn't I check those things before I put it on my site, thereby adding my endorsement to it and share it with my friends? So we think that some of these basic skills are what I would call wariness skills. They are, before you accept and share, ask whether you can trust. What do you know about source? What do you know about accuracy? And then can we build the skill set? Because the digital world gives you the capacities to find out what is good and bad information. Can we build the skill set that increases the likelihood that students, and hence ultimately adults, know where to go online to find information that they can trust?
Another question. Does the rise in polarization represent a change in societal norms?
It doesn't so much represent a change as it creates a feedback loop between changed norms and behaviors that then change the norms. So the assumption in the past had been that there were you could say disparaging things that impugn the reputation and integrity of others, but you'd say it in very small venues. So you might say it at a bar, or you might put disparaging things on, say, a restroom wall. I mean, now we have a capacity, because you've got a digital environment, to anonymize that discourse and to move it out to much larger audiences of people, and to aggregate more like-minded audiences who will flock to you because they already endorse those sentiments. So it's possible that we had a lot of those sentiments in the past. We just didn't have a way of gathering up the audiences that shared them in a way that would magnify them and increase the likelihood that they would actually influence our politics.
Another question, which rings really true to my heart: how can businesses encourage civic literacy?
When a member in business comes and says, "I just got a jury summons, what should I do?" If the business says, you should serve, we're happy to have you do that, because your commitment to the process ensures that this process is going to work well for everybody. So the first thing is, suggest normatively that jury service is a desirable behavior, not a behavior that we're going to help you get out of. And then second, use that opportunity to increase the likelihood that people understand what it is that the jury system is designed to do and why it is that the employer values this as service. Another is increasing the likelihood that people see voting as something that's desirable and have the opportunity to vote. In places in which you have to vote on a specific day, make sure that that day is a day in which people can get the time that they need to cast the ballot. It'd be awful if you looked out and saw your employees in line as the polls closed at 8 o'clock because they couldn't get out of work until 6 o'clock and they couldn't get to the polls in time to cast their vote. So at the minimum, suggest the social desirability of two important modes of democratic engagement: voting and serving on juries.
Well, thank you for that, Kathleen. And unfortunately, we are out of time. What I would like to say to the audience, though, is what doesn't get noted all that often is that institutions like the one that Kathleen represents are the result of philanthropic support from business leaders.
Yeah.
So Walter Annenberg, who is the benefactor behind the Annenberg Public Policy Center, as well as many other institutions, was a very successful executive, business owner, and also public servant. And he had a quote: "Citizenship is every person's highest calling." And I thought that was a really apt way to bridge from your last answer to my close. As we heard today, citizenship requires work, lots of work. And it's work that all of us must put in to ensure democracy and free enterprise remain rock solid for the next few centuries. So thank you for joining this conversation of Civics Forward. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully you've learned something. I know I have. Please reach out if there are any topics or guests you'd like us to consider for future programs. You can also visit uschamberfoundation.org to learn more about the Civic Trust, the National Civics Bee, and ways you can get involved in your community. Until the next time, thank you very much. This is Michael Carney for the U.S. Chamber Foundation, wishing you a good day.